You can't leave, not because of the relationship, because of money. If you do, everything changes. Where you live, what you pay, how stable things feel. So you stay. It makes sense. On the surface, it looks like the responsible decision. You're avoiding disruption, protecting stability, keeping things from getting worse. But over time, something else starts collapsing. Not slowly, quietly at first, then faster than you expect. Your energy drops, your focus weakens, decisions you used to make easily start feeling heavier. You stop pushing in areas that used to move forward without effort. And none of it looks connected to the relationship. It just feels like your life is getting harder to manage, like things you used to control start slipping without warning. Because the problem isn't just that you're staying, it's what staying is forcing you to become. Every time you hold something back, every time you adjust to keep things stable, every time you ignore a signal that something isn't working, you're not just maintaining the relationship, you're reshaping your behavior around it, making yourself smaller in ways that don't show up immediately, until the version of you that made things work in the first place starts disappearing. And that's when everything begins to feel off. Not just the relationship, everything. The reason this feels so convincing is because it looks like stability. The bills are still being paid, the routine is still intact, nothing has collapsed in an obvious way, so your brain keeps confirming the same idea. Staying is safer, leaving is the risk. But that calculation is incomplete because it only measures what changes immediately. It doesn't measure what changes quietly and compounds over time. The longer you stay in something that isn't working, the more your system starts adapting around it. You become more careful, more filtered, more focused on avoiding disruption than moving forward. And that shift doesn't stay contained to the relationship. It spreads into how you think, how you plan, how much you push yourself. The energy that used to go into building something starts getting redirected into maintaining something. And maintenance feels productive, but it doesn't create momentum. Over time, this creates a quiet reversal. You're protecting stability, but losing progress, avoiding risk, but shrinking your range. And because nothing dramatic is happening, it's easy to miss, until you start noticing that things outside the relationship aren't moving the way they used to. Not because you lost ability, because your system is no longer oriented toward growth. It's oriented toward preservation. And preservation, over time, starts to look like decline. Money isn't the reason you can't leave. It's the explanation your brain uses to justify why leaving feels impossible. At a certain point, this stops being a decision and becomes a system, not something you think about, something you operate inside. You begin scanning for tension before it happens, adjusting your tone, editing what you say, choosing the version of yourself that keeps things stable. And because this happens in small moments, it doesn't feel like a sacrifice. It feels normal. But every adjustment has a cost. Each time you hold something back, you reinforce a version of yourself built around avoiding disruption. And over time, that version becomes automatic. You stop noticing it until it starts showing up in places that have nothing to do with the relationship. You hesitate more, you second guess more, you avoid pushing forward in situations where there's uncertainty, because your system has learned that uncertainty leads to loss. So it narrows your behavior to reduce that risk. And the narrower your behavior becomes, the less room you have to act freely. This is how the trap strengthens. Not because something is forcing you to stay, but because staying is quietly changing how you operate. And the more it changes you, the harder it becomes to imagine leaving, not just financially, but mentally. At that point, it's no longer just about staying. It's about who you are inside the relationship. Because the longer you remain in it, the more your identity starts organizing around maintaining it. You become the one who keeps things steady, the one who doesn't push too far, the one who absorbs tension instead of creating it. And that identity starts to feel necessary, not optional. If you stop playing that role, the relationship feels unstable. So you continue, not because you consciously chose it, but because it feels like the only version of you that works inside that environment. Over time, this creates a kind of lock-in. The relationship depends on you being a certain way, and you begin depending on the relationship to validate that version of yourself, even if it's not a version you would choose freely. This is why leaving starts to feel more complicated than just changing your financial situation, because you're not only walking away from a person, you're walking away from a role you've been performing consistently. And the moment that role disappears, there's a gap, a loss of structure, a version of you that hasn't stabilized yet. That gap feels like risk, and your brain translates that risk into something easier to point to: money. Because money is measurable, predictable, easier to justify. But what actually feels unstable is not your finances, it's your identity without the relationship holding it in place. This is why the trap feels so convincing. You tell yourself you're staying because leaving would be too expensive. Rent would change, bills would increase, stability would drop. And all of that is real, but it's only part of the equation. Because the longer you stay, the more your capacity to handle change starts shrinking without you noticing. Your tolerance for uncertainty drops, your willingness to take risks decreases, your confidence in making independent decisions weakens. And that shift doesn't show up in numbers. It shows up in what you no longer feel able to do. If this were only about money, you would still feel capable of leaving. What's changed is that you no longer feel able to handle what happens after. This is why the financial argument feels so strong. It feels objective, it feels responsible, but it's covering something else. The fact that leaving doesn't just require money, it requires a version of you that can tolerate disruption, uncertainty, and temporary instability. And that version is exactly what starts fading the longer you stay. So the equation reverses. It starts to feel like you can't leave because of money, when in reality, it's becoming harder to leave because what staying is doing to you. And the more that internal capacity shrinks, the more convincing the financial reason becomes. At some point, the logic flips completely. What started as staying to protect stability becomes the thing quietly removing it. Not in a visible way, in a functional way. You still go to work, you still pay bills, but the version of you doing it is different, slower, less certain, less willing to take on anything that might create pressure. And that changes what your life can support. Opportunities feel heavier, decisions feel riskier, even small changes feel harder to manage because your system has been trained to avoid disruption, not navigate it. This is where the trap tightens. The less capable you feel, the more necessary the relationship appears. And the more necessary it appears, the harder it becomes to leave. Not because the situation improved, but because your ability to operate outside of it has been reduced. And that reduction becomes the proof your brain uses. You see the numbers, you feel the limitations, and it all points in the same direction: stay. Even though staying is what created the limitation in the first place. The relationship didn't just become something you depend on, it became something that changed your ability to function without it. And once that happens, leaving doesn't feel like a decision you're choosing to avoid, it feels like something you're no longer capable of doing. So it stops looking like a choice, it looks like reality. You can't leave because the numbers don't work, because stability would collapse, because everything would get harder. And on the surface, all of that is true. But underneath it, something else has already shifted. The version of you that could have handled leaving is no longer fully there. It's been reshaped by staying, conditioned to avoid disruption, trained to preserve what exists instead of building something new. And that pattern reinforces itself the longer it continues, until leaving no longer feels like a risk you're choosing to avoid, it feels like something you're no longer capable of doing.